And first off, just want to say thanks for running these seminars. They're really an incredible resource and a wonderful way to connect with the glaciological community, especially for smaller glaciology programs like myself and my research group. So it's really wonderful to be able to connect. I do come from a civil engineering background. I got into things specifically for glacier outburst floods, and then started thinking about debris-covered glaciers and how they were evolving to form glacial lakes. And you're absolutely right that it wasn't until I started working with Regina Hawk at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that I really got into these large-scale and global glacier evolution modeling. So she converted me, and I'm not going to be looking back. So I'm really thrilled to be here today and to share some results that I've been working on for the last 4 years. There we go. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this work would not have been possible without the support of an incredible group of collaborators who are listed here. Two that I specifically want to highlight are Regina Hawk, who I've been working on this with for the last 4 years since I've been a postdoc and research associate at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I also want to recognize Fabian Massillon, who I've had the absolute pleasure of working with for the last 1.5 years. It was actually my last trip before COVID. And once I really realized the true power of making our model, PyGEM, the Python Glacier Evolution model, compatible with OGGM, the Open Global Glacier model, it's really opened a lot of opportunities to do exciting science, and hopefully this work will continue to be beneficial to the open source community as well. And then lastly, before I get started, I want to recognize sources of funding, which have primarily been through the NASA High Mountain Asia team and the NASA Sea Level Change science team. Okay, so let's get started. So we're all well aware that glaciers are responding to climate change. And this is true for clean ice glaciers, as shown in this rendering of Rhone Glacier in Switzerland between 1850 and 2000. The same is true for tidewater glaciers. So here's an example of John Muir Glacier in Alaska, shown here in the 1940s and in the early 2000s. And the same is also true for debris-covered glaciers. And this is the glacier that I did my PhD fieldwork on, Imja Glacier in Nepal. And you can see 1955 and 2007. So we're all very well aware that these glaciers are changing and that they're important with respect to water resources, sea level rise, glacier hazards like glacier outburst floods. However, our ability to predict the response of these glaciers to climate change using large-scale models has primarily been limited to regional or global scales. And so if we look at sort of the current standard of glacier projections, what's typically used in reports like the IPCC AR6 is the results from the Glacier Model Intercomparison Project, or Glacier MIP. And so this aggregated 11 different models, so a lot of different research groups, 279 simulations, and looked at mass changes and area changes for various RCP scenarios from present to 2100. And so here you see that the glaciers are projected to lose between 17 and 38%, depending on the representative concentration pathway. And the contribution to sea level rise and sea level equivalent ranges from about 75 to 165 millimeters, depending on the scenario. So our actions as a global society can really have a big impact on what's going to happen in the future. Glacier MIP also provides a look into regional variations, which is shown in the figure here. Once again, it's showing the mass remaining relative to 2015. And in many regions with the greatest volume of ice, so for example, in the Arctic, peripheral glaciers in Antarctica, we see that there's a lot of mass remaining by the end of the century, typically on the order of about 60 to 90%. If you compare this to other regions, specifically typically at lower latitudes like Central Europe or the Caucasus, they're projected to experience much higher amounts of relative mass loss, ranging from almost near complete deglaciation to upwards of about having 40% remaining by the end of the century, obviously depending on the RCP scenario. And these projections form the primary basis of the IPCC AR6, although I should note that there are some additional models that were run for shared socioeconomic pathways. And there were also some emulators that were used to expand the projections to GCMs and scenarios that were not a part of Glacier MIP, but more on the comparisons to that to come later. So what I'm going to talk about today are two things. One is really seeking to refine glacier projections by harnessing the data revolution. There's really been a lot of remarkable work by various groups producing large-scale systematic data sets. What I'm going to focus on today are systematic data sets of glacier mass balance, but they're really revolutionizing how we can calibrate our glacier evolution models. And the second thing that I'm going to talk about today is accounting for key physical processes that are either limited in how they're accounted for in existing global glacier models, or some that are actually still missing in global glacier models. And so with this mindset, really thinking about how we can push forward the open source global glacier evolution models. So the model that I'll be talking about today is a combination of the Python glacier evolution model PyGEM, which is what I've been working on for the last 4 years, and the open global glacier model OGGM, which has been led by Fabian Massione. And about 1.5 years ago, we decided to try to make these models compatible with one another. And there have certainly been some challenges associated with that, but we really haven't looked back. And I think it's really starting to open the doors to do a lot of exciting science, both shown here and moving forward in the future. So the simulations and the model results that I'm going to show, they utilize mass balance estimates from PyGEM. So we compute the mass balance based off of the accumulation, the refreeze, the melt, and the frontal ablation. And then we update the glacier geometry annually. And we do this using OGGM's glacier dynamics module, which is a 1D flowline model based off of the shallow ice approximation. Now, the model obviously requires some climate data for forcing. And so for present day, we're using ERA 5. And when we look at both back in the past and in the future, we utilize an ensemble of GCMs, RCPs, and SSPs. And the model also requires ice thickness estimates. And so here, once again, we're relying on OGGM. This enables us to utilize the mass balance gradient that we produce from PyGEM in order to invert for ice thickness. And the benefit of this is that we produce ice thickness estimates that are internally consistent with our mass balance gradients. The other thing to note is that we have 4 model parameters. So 3 of these model parameters are related to the mass balance calculations. These include the degree day factor of snow, which controls the melting, the temperature bias, which adjusts the temperature and thereby controls the melting, and also differentiating between liquid and solid precipitation, and the precipitation factor, which controls the amount of precipitation. And then the 4th parameter is related to the glacier dynamics, which is the creep parameter. And this really controls the ice dynamics, the stiffness of the ice, and also the ice thickness estimates. And so what we do is we calibrate the creep parameter in each region to be consistent, such that our total ice volume is consistent with the existing consensus ice thickness products. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're really interested in harnessing this data revolution, but for context, it's helpful to look at previous studies. So previous studies were calibrated based off of really limited data, but this was the best data that was available at the time. So you can see these obviously aren't all of previous studies, just a subset, but the amount of data ranges from about glaciological measurements up to about 300 glaciers. These obviously have the challenge of figuring out how do you transfer model parameters from these 300 glaciers to those without data. And alternatively, you see other studies that have relied on regional mass change data sets or subregional, depending on the scale. Now, fortunately, we've entered this period of unprecedented monitoring of glaciers. And so here I'm showing an example of a study that was led by David Sheen and others for high mountain Asia. And they resolved the mass balance of almost all 95,000 glaciers in high mountain Asia. So you can see really the level of detail here. The circles are sized by the glacier area. The blues are showing more positive, and you can see the Karakoram and and Kunlun with the Karakoram anomaly. And then you can also see more negative mass balances in the Himalayas. And so this is where we did a lot of model development for PyGEM. So you can see by context, when we start looking and comparing the amount of data that we're working with now with 95,000 glaciers compared to several hundred glaciers, it's really going to revolutionize the way that we think about our ability to model and calibrate those glacier evolution models. Now, more recently, a study that was led by Rome and Huguenet and others, they measured the geodetic mass balance for all glaciers globally, which is shown in the figure here. You can see that these measurements obviously capture the spatial variations in glacier mass balance in remarkable detail. So, for example, here in Alaska, you can see some significant differences between glaciers that are along the southeastern coastline versus glaciers that are more interior. You see the Karakoram anomaly, so neutral or more positive mass balances in the Karakoram and Kunlun, just like David Sheen and others found. And these changes are really apparent wherever you go. You can see significant regional variation in Southern Andes. Any region that you go to, it's really highlighting these variations. Now, the big question is, what do we do with all of this data? Because we now have data for all 200,000 glaciers, and it's really important to figure out the best way to utilize this data. Now, the one major issue that we run into is that all existing models are over-parameterized. So the plot that you're seeing here on the y-axis, it shows the mass balance. That gray line is showing the observed mass balance. So it's at about negative 0.3 meters of water equivalent per year. And then the shaded gray is showing you the uncertainty associated with that observation based off of one standard deviation. On the x-axis, you see one of our model parameters, the temperature bias. And so you see how the mass balance varies with respect to the temperature bias. And then the line colors show the impact of the degree day factor of snow. And then the line style show the impact of the precipitation factor. Now, the key takeaway here is that anywhere that these colored lines pass over that gray line is perfect agreement between the modeled mass balance and the observed mass balance. So intuitively, it's pretty easy to tell that there are an infinite number of model parameter combinations that will give you perfect agreement between the observed and the modeled mass balance. And this is without even thinking about the uncertainty associated with that observation. And so previous studies, they determined a single set of model parameters and then moved on. Now, I'm not going to dive into this in too much detail. If you're interested in the details, I suggest looking up the paper that we published in the Journal of Glaciology about 1.5 years ago. But what we do is we're using Bayesian inference in order to assess that parameter uncertainty and calibrate our model. And what Bayes' theorem does is essentially it combines our prior knowledge of the model parameters with the observed mass balance data in order to provide information about each of our 3 model parameters given that mass balance data. And the one major difference between the work I'm presenting today and the previous study is we now utilize an emulator for the forward model. And this really helps us reduce the computational expense by more than a factor of 100. So that's really exciting. In order to implement this Bayesian inference, we use Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. We did a lot of diagnostics in that Journal of Glaciology paper, and we found that approximately 10,000 simulations is good enough to find convergence regardless of your starting point. And so what this calibration procedure does is it produces 10,000 sets of model parameters. Now, some of these are correlated, so the real amount of model parameters that are independent from one another vary on the order of about 100 to several hundred. But what you can see is these model parameters then capture the uncertainty associated with the observed mass balance, which is shown here in black. So the observed mass balance is around negative 0.3, and you can see the various sets of model parameters produce model estimates that reflect that observation. And so we can do this for every single glacier using the geodetic mass balance data set. Now, in the figure that we show here, these are results based off of high mountain Asia, and we're really highlighting the spatial variations in each of the model parameters. And we see that there are significant regional variations, but what's also really interesting is that we're actually able to see what appear to be some physical signals in this. So for example, in the inset figure that I show here with the precipitation factor, I outlined kind of the top of the Himalayas. And so we can see that on the windward side, we see higher precipitation factors, and on the leeward side, we see lower precipitation factors. And so really what we're doing is we're capturing the orographic effect, which, not unsurprisingly, is not really captured with the course era interim data, given that the glaciers are really, can be in the same pixel, but on opposite sides of the mountain. So this is really exciting to see that we actually see some physical signals as well. So what we can do with this is we can start to assess the model parameter uncertainty. So this is a simulation for a single glacier where we look at the output of 100 different model parameter combinations. And this is what we do for every single glacier. We do 100 different simulations. And then for the climate forcing uncertainty, in this case, we're using 22 different GCMs for one RCP scenario. And so we can compare how the model parameter uncertainty compares to the climate forcing uncertainty. And so for a single glacier, especially for small glaciers, we find that the model parameter uncertainty can be significant. In some cases, it can actually exceed the climate forcing, depending on how much uncertainty is in the mass balance observation. However, when we get to larger glaciers, and especially to larger spatial scales and start aggregating the results, we find that the climate forcing uncertainty is what dominates. And so moving forward, the results that I'm going to show you are the multi-GCM mean and standard deviations. So we ran projections for an ensemble of GCMs, of RCPs, and SSPs. The ensemble of RCPs that we used was the same as Glacier MIP, such that we could compare our projections to the existing ones that are out there. And so the figure that you see here is showing you the projected mass remaining through 2100 relative to 2015 for all glaciers globally. And so the solid colored lines, they're showing you the multi-GCM means for various SSP scenarios. And then the dashed lines are showing you or the dotted lines are showing you the RCP scenarios. And in order to avoid some clutter, we represent the uncertainty as one standard deviation, but we only show it for SSP 126 and SSP 585. So what we find is that the glaciers are projected to lose between 29% and 47% of their mass, depending on the SSP scenario. At the global scale, we find that this mass loss is similar between the SSP and the RCP scenarios. So if you look at the same colored lines, they're not too far apart from one another. I'll note that at the regional scale, we can start to see differences on the order of 10 to 15%, but I didn't show those results here. So when we think about the comparison of our projections to Glacier MIP, we're seeing projected mass losses that are approximately 10% greater than Glacier MIP. So Glacier MIP was looking at 17 to 38% mass loss depending on the RCP scenario. So we're a little bit higher, a little bit more mass loss than Glacier MIP. Now, at the regional scale, we also find considerable differences in the mass remaining by the end of the century. And this figure is also showing the contributions of sea level rise. So the pie charts are showing the relative mass remaining for each SSP scenario. And so that's what you can see. In red, you have SSP 585, 370, 245, and 126. And the fraction that they cover is indicative of the region's mass remaining by the end of the century. Now, the pie charts are sized by the region's contribution to sea level rise, specifically for SSP 585. So this gives you an indication of the initial glacier mass, but really it gives you an indication of their contribution to sea level rise, and the numbers in there reflect the actual contribution to sea level rise, both globally, so right around 170 millimeters of sea level equivalent, and then the contribution for each region as well. So consistent with previous studies, including the recent IPCC report, we find that low latitude regions, so for example, Western Canada, Central Europe, Caucasus, Middle East, the low latitudes, even Southeast Asia, we find that they might actually experience near complete deglaciation with less than 10% remaining for SSP 585. For SSP 126, the mass remaining, the projections are a little bit better. They're on the order of 20 to 40%, but still really significant amounts of mass loss for these regions. Now, if we look at the larger regions, so especially in the Arctic and the Antarctic, we find that projections have considerably more mass remaining by the end of the century. These are also the regions that are the largest contributors to sea level rise based off of their initial volume. And what this really indicates is that glaciers are going to continue to be a major contributor to sea level rise well past 2100. Now, the last element on this figure are these heat plot maps. And so what these heat plot maps are showing in red below each of the pie charts is the annual regional specific mass balance in units of meters of water equivalent per year for both SSP 245, so that's what's shown on the top of the heat plot, and then SSP 585 is shown on the bottom. So in some regions, you can see that SSP 585 causes very high specific mass loss rates, exceeding losses on the order of about 3.5 meters of water equivalent per year. So this includes regions like in Alaska, in Iceland, in the Russian Arctic, really, really heavy rates of glacier mass loss by the end of the century. In these regions, you'll see that they start to stabilize a bit more for SSP 245, and that stabilization is typically on the order of about -1 to -2 meters of water equivalent per year. So they're projected to continue losing mass heavily. By comparison, regions that experience significant mass losses that are the ones that are nearing complete deglaciation by the end of the century, so places like Central Europe, South Asia East, New Zealand, the glacier elevation retreat feedbacks cause these regions to find a near balance, specific mass balance by the end of the century for SSP 245, and considerably smaller mass loss rates around 1 meter water equivalent per year by the end of the century. Unfortunately, this is primarily because most of their glacier mass has already been melted and has been lost. Now, one exciting element of these new projections is that we can now resolve the subregional changes. And that's not to say that previous models weren't able to do this, because they absolutely did. They projected the changes for each glacier. But the difference is that our glacier projections are calibrated with geodetic mass balance data from every glacier. And therefore, when we resolve these spatio and temporal variations, we can have a bit higher confidence at these higher resolutions. So for example, the figure that you're looking at shows the mass remaining by 2100 relative to 2015. And this is shown for SSP 245. So the tiles show the glacier mass remaining that's aggregated to 1 to 2 degrees depending on the latitude. And so here we're highlighting the spatial variations in mass loss at the subregional level. So if we go in and we look at Alaska, for example, we can see that in some areas we're seeing near complete deglaciation in the western part of Canada and the western part of the US, while when we look out on the southeastern coast, we see that there's a lot of significant mass remaining by the end of the century. We can see similar trends and similar differences in high mountain Asia, right? So the area of the Karakoram and Kunlun, we see that there's a significant amount of mass that's remaining by the end of the century, while when we go more into the interior Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas and other regions, we see that they have much more significant mass loss. Now, if we look at SSP 585, it obviously provides a much sadder picture. And what I think is really apparent here is you see so much dark red. So here's SSP 245 and here's 585. And so this puts it into perspective a little bit more than just what you can look at by those pie charts that I showed earlier. that there are many areas around the world that are going to be experiencing near complete deglaciation if the climate scenarios follow trends towards SSP 585. So while the shared socioeconomic pathways and the RCP scenarios are really fascinating to look at, policy and decision makers, they're typically interested in the impacts associated with a certain increase in global mean temperature compared to pre-industrial levels. So for example, what happens if there's 1 degree of warming or 2 degrees of warming compared to those pre-industrial levels. And so what we did is we took all of the SSP scenarios and we aggregated those projections into various temperature increases. So here we're showing 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and 5 degrees for the different colors. And the box and whisker charts that you're seeing in the center here, those are showing you the distribution of those products at 2100. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that we don't show a 1 degree increase, primarily because there weren't many GCMs that fell into that category, even when we included shared socioeconomic pathways from SSP 1.19. So as you can see, limiting the global mean temperature increase to 1.5 to 2 degrees, so that's these blue lines here, it would keep that global mean sea level under 100 millimeters of sea level equivalent. And it's important to note here that we also correct the sea level rise estimates to account for the volume of ice loss that's already below the water level, which can be an important distinction in how it alters the magnitude of those sea level rise projections. Now, if we don't take action as a global society and eventually experience increases on the order of +5 degrees, which I really hope does not happen, but then we'd be following scenarios that are closer to those SSP 585. And then we'd obviously see significantly more sea level rise on the order of approximately 170 millimeters of sea level equivalent by 2100. Now, instead of looking at the time series, which we showed on the last plot, we can also take a look at the impact of the global mean temperature change and the contribution of sea level rise by 2100 relative to 2015 for each region. And so these plots are really showing the sensitivity of each region to small changes in the global mean temperature. So on the y-axis, you see the sea level rise contribution, and on the x-axis, you have the increase in global mean temperature. And the circles here are showing the shared socioeconomic pathways. The diamonds are showing the representative concentration pathways, and the colors are showing the radiative forcing associated with those scenarios. The lines that you see here, so for example, with Alaska, Svalbard, Central Europe, et cetera, these are showing what is sort of the maximum contribution from that region to sea level rise. So if complete deglaciation did occur, this is obviously the maximum contribution that could occur. What's really interesting to look at is that in regions like Central Europe, we see that keeping the global mean temperature to below 2 degrees would have a significant impact on the volume remaining. Whereas once you get to 3 degrees and higher, we start to see near complete deglaciation of the region. And Western Canada, USA shows similarly high sensitivity to temperature change. So you can see that those scenarios that are closer to 1.5 degrees, there's still a good bit of mass remaining. The sea level contribution isn't too high, but really once you get to around 3 degrees, we start to see near complete deglaciation of those regions as well. So this really highlights the sensitivity of these regions to small changes in the global mean temperature. And for other regions, these plots also give you a sense of their sensitivity as well. And this is, sort of the basis of the emulator approach, right? You can fit emulators that are based off of the global mean temperature change and then run these for a variety of scenarios. So circling back to our research objectives, the first one, we see that there is a large variety of ways in which we can analyze these results depending on our interests. So we can compare these results to previous studies, we can assess various climate scenarios, we can look at policy relevant temperature scenarios, we can see the impacts at regional or sub-regional scales. And what we find is really mixed results with respect to how they compare to previous studies. So our sea level rise projections, they fall somewhere between the emulator approach from Edwards and others that was recently published in Nature and formed the basis of much of the IPCC work. And so our projections are higher than those. When we compare to the physical modeling approaches that were used by PyGEM and OGGM that supported the IPCC AR6, we find that our projections are actually lower than those. So we're somewhere in the middle. And we also see significant regional differences when we're comparing to glacier myth. So for the second half of my talk, I'd like to discuss some of the recent advances with respect to representing key physical processes. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to discuss my personal favorite, which is debris-covered glaciers, what I did my PhD on. But it's also worth noting here that we have done a considerable amount of work on accounting for frontal ablation, which I'm not going to show here today. So recent studies have mapped the debris cover extent. The figure shown here is from Dirk Schurler and others. And they estimate that around 4 to 7% of the glaciers globally is covered by debris. That's the glacier area. And we see that specific areas, for example, high mountain Asia, Alaska, Central Europe, these can have much higher amounts of debris cover. And in some areas, it can approach on the order of about 30%. Here's an example of what a debris-covered glacier looks like, specifically for Imja Lhotse Shar Glacier, where I did my PhD work. This is a glacier located in the Everest region of Nepal. And so you can see here that there's a layer on top of the clean ice. And this is really especially clear if you look at that calving front or on top of the exposed ice cliffs. You can see the clean ice with the debris on top of it. And if we zoom in on this glacier, then we can see this is really a highly heterogeneous surface. So the surface comprises boulders that can be over 1 meter in diameter, but we also see a lot of smaller cobbles and pebbles, as well as finer sands and silts. In the background of this image, you can see there's an ice cliff. You can also see a superglacial pond. And these are very typical features on debris-covered glaciers, especially on the tongues. And so it becomes really clear that when we're trying to model the processes associated with debris, we're modeling something that's fairly complex and highly heterogeneous. Now, the primary reason that we care about debris cover to begin with is because we want to know how it affects the subdebris glacier melt. So it's very well known that the debris thickness controls the subdebris melt rate. So a thin layer of debris on the order of a few centimeters will enhance melt, while thicker debris will insulate the underlying ice and reduce melt compared to clean ice. And this is what the figure on the left here is showing, the melt on the y-axis and the melt reduction for increasing debris thickness on the x-axis. So if you want to be able to account for debris in large-scale or global glacier evolution models, what we really need to know is information concerning the debris thickness and also how that debris thickness is going to impact the ablation areas. Unfortunately, debris thickness measurements are really sparse. So measurements typically come from manual excavation, so just digging holes in debris. Not too bad if the debris is fairly thin, but when you get to areas that are greater than 1 meter, it becomes quite painful. Ground penetrating radar helps alleviate this. Obviously, you're carrying equipment over a very heterogeneous surface. And then you can also use ice cliffs, and you can measure them either in situ or from structure from motion. I don't show a photo of that here, but it's a nice shortcut method in a way that can give you some good debris thickness measurements. The problem with this is that because we have so few debris thickness measurements, it's been pretty hard to think of ways to account for debris in global glacier models. And so what we did was we developed a new method to estimate the debris thickness for all glaciers globally, or debris-covered glaciers globally, I should say. And so what this new method did was it combined subdebris melt inversion methods and surface temperature inversion methods. So subdebris melt inversion methods, what we do is we use elevation change, surface velocity, and ice thickness estimates in order to resolve the climatic mass balance, specifically on the terminus of debris-covered glaciers. And so once we have an understanding of what that climatic mass balance is, we can then run a model for a variety of different debris thicknesses. And based off of where we find agreement between those observations and the modeled melt, we can invert for the debris thickness. This method works really well, especially for stagnant glaciers. It becomes a bit problematic for actively flowing areas of the glaciers. And so what we do is we use a surface temperature inversion method in order to be able to account for the spatial variations of the debris cover. So here are some of our estimates for some of the most well-studied debris-covered glaciers. These are located all over in Alaska, Central Europe, and high mountain Asia. Consistent with expectations, we find that the debris thickness is very thin, so less than 2 centimeters at the transition between that debris cover and clean ice. And then as you move down glacier, so the arrows point in the general flow direction, the debris thickness increases. And so for some glaciers like Kennecott Glacier in Alaska, we see the maximum debris thickness is on the order of about 0.6 meters. For other glaciers like Coxgar and Nzumpa, we find that the debris thickness can actually exceed 2 meters. So you can have really, really thick debris. Now, while these debris thickness estimates are useful for geomorphological or landscape evolution model studies, when we talk about accounting for debris in global glacier evolution models, what we really want to know is how is that debris thickness going to affect the melt rates? And so what we did was we ended up modeling the clean ice melt as well. And by using that estimate of the clean ice melt, we could normalize the sub-debris melt rates. And so we refer to this as the sub-debris melt enhancement factors. Or enhancement factors, to be short. And so, as you would expect, where the debris cover is really thin, we can have enhancement factors that are around or exceed the value of 1. And conversely, where the debris is really thick, we can see factors that are less than 0.1. And so that's what's showing here for Coxgar and Nzumpa and large portions of Khumbu Glacier. And so what that means is that a value of 0.1 means that we're reducing melt by more than 90% compared to clean ice. And so these enhancement factors can be used to modify degree day factors of clean ice and thereby enable us to account for the debris thickness in our models, which is super exciting. So now that we have a way of accounting for the impact of the debris cover on the sub-debris melt rates, it's important from a glacier evolution perspective to think about how the glacier is going to evolve. So this is a nice schematic from Doug Benn and others that shows a debris-covered glacier and its response to climate change. So if we use the ELA, the equilibrium line altitude, as a proxy for the health of the glacier, then we can see a glacier in equilibrium is going to have a nice balance between the climatic mass balance and the terminus, and then there's going to be a nice flux of ice coming from the accumulation area, as shown by these red arrows. Now, as the climate forcing changes, we can expect to see a retreat in the equilibrium line altitude to higher elevations. And so what this means is that our ablation area is expanding, our accumulation area is shrinking, and as a result of this reduced accumulation area, there's going to be less ice that's moving towards the terminus of the glacier, which is shown here by these arrows. And so what we expect to see is a stagnating and flattening of the slope of the terminus of these debris-covered glaciers. And so this is something that this glacier stagnation is something that's been really well documented by both field and remote sensing studies. But what becomes very clear from this is that to properly model the evolution of debris-covered glaciers, you really need to account for the glacier dynamics properly. And so to highlight this, we show the evolution of a well-studied, heavily debris-covered glacier. This is Khumbu Glacier, located in the Everest region of Nepal. So here you can see a profile of the ice thickness along the center flow line as a function of the elevation. And so what we're going to do is run a variety of simulations that will enable us to see how the debris-covered glacier evolves for various glacier dynamics parameterizations and mass balance parameterizations. So the first run that we show is from our 2020 study that was published in Frontiers in Earth Science that we used to model all glaciers in high mountain Asia. And so this model uses mass redistribution curves, sometimes referred to as delta H parameterizations, following Huss and Hawk 2015. And essentially what it does is it takes the glacier-wide mass in a manner that accounts for the flux divergence. But it's really important to note that these curves were developed based off of glaciers in Central Europe. So for the mass balance parameterization, in this case, we're not explicitly accounting for debris. Instead, we're really implicitly accounting for debris based off of the calibration procedure. So we use the geodetic mass balance, which obviously includes the impacts of debris within the observation for the calibration. So in a way, it's accounting for debris, but it's treating the surface as clean ice. So as you would expect, what you see if you compare the plot in the center to the plot on the left, you see that this glacier retreats just like a clean ice glacier. Now, the second simulation that we perform is seeing what happens when we add debris. So there is a slight change in the volume and area by the end of the century, but broadly speaking, the glacier retreats just like a clean ice glacier as well. And the reason for this is because the mass redistribution curves force it to. They were developed based off of clean ice glaciers. And so this is why, if you're trying to capture the expected stagnation associated with the evolution of debris-covered glaciers, it's really essential to use some form of a flowline model. To be thorough, we next show the use of a flowline model, but not accounting for the debris thickness and the mass balance parameterization. As expected, since we aren't accounting for the debris, the glacier once again retreats like a clean ice glacier. In this case, we actually see slightly more mass loss, which we attribute to the glacier retreat elevation feedbacks. And then lastly, if we account for debris and we use a flowline model, then we can capture the expected glacier stagnation. In fact, we actually see a separation where essentially we have a dead ice glacier at the terminus of Khumbu Glacier. And part of this is because that terminus has very, very thick debris. It can exceed 1 meter in thickness. So this simply becomes dead ice. It could potentially form a glacial lake within this over deepening, although we don't account for those processes yet in our model. So now we can see that we can capture the anticipated feedbacks that we would expect associated with debris-covered glaciers. So we're showing an example of the ice thickness profile by 2100 for Khumbu Glacier for various SSP scenarios. So at the top, we just show the ice thickness. The dotted line shows the initial ice thickness, so you can look at the changes. The lines are color-coded by the SSP scenarios. The inset plot shows the relative mass change over time. So for Khumbu Glacier, we predict that the glacier will detach from the terminus. And depending on the SSP scenario, we actually might see retreat that goes beyond the famous Khumbu icefall by 2100. So for SSP 126 and 245, we see that there is ice remaining in the Khumbu icefall. For SSP 370 and 585, we actually see that it's gone. So to determine the impact of accounting for debris on regional scales, we run an additional simulation where we assume there's no debris cover, and instead we model the entire area as clean ice. And so for most scenarios, interestingly, we don't see too much of a difference between these two simulations. The primary differences that we do see are typically happening in the middle of the century. So for example, you can see some significant differences in South Asia East here, in New Zealand, for example. But these are primarily occurring in the middle of the century or by the end of the century for regions that have very thick debris, like in Southeast Asia. So what you're seeing here is really that the insulating effects of the debris cover, they can't prevent melting entirely. And so in many regions, especially for the warmest scenarios associated with SSP 585, that increase in temperature and the consequent increase in melt is simply too great and overcomes that insulating effect that the debris cover has. And so this is especially true for regions that are expected to experience significant deglaciation, like Central Europe, the low latitudes, and the Caucasus, Middle East. For these scenarios, there's almost no difference between the glaciers, primarily because they're seeing such high amounts of mass loss. So circling back to the highlights of my talk, the example showed how we can utilize various remote sensing data sets to account for a process that's debris cover that is currently missing in global glacier evolution models. Interestingly, for debris cover, we see fairly limited impacts at the regional or global scale, especially by the end of the century. But at the glacier scale and shorter time scales, this can be really important. And this is important if we start thinking about things like the evolution of glacial lakes and glacier outburst flood hazards. But bringing this all together, the key takeaway is really that large-scale systematic data sets are really revolutionizing our glacier evolution models. And this also includes the open source tools and code that is typically accompanying those data sets. We're really moving forward as a community in that, which is incredibly exciting to see, and also the open source models that are working to integrate those data sets. Hence, it's a really exciting time to be in this field. And I feel like there are so many exciting studies that are constantly coming out, many of which have been highlighted here, that there's a lot of fun future work to be had. Some of these studies, they include mass balance data sets like I've shown. Additionally, data sets like altimetry or gravimetry are going to be really important. Surface velocity data sets can help us constrain the glacier dynamics. A variety of products from synthetic aperture radar and optical data sets. Thinking about novel ways that we can integrate these together. So for example, by using them to resolve the climatic mass balance gradients. These are all going to give us an incredible amount of data that we can use to calibrate, validate, or constrain our models. And it's really important to note that these two bullets really go hand in hand. These data sets are also enabling us to account for key processes in ways that we weren't able to do before, and potentially calibrate and validate those new processes as well. And so as a result, we are really able to refine the glacier projections even further. And these glacier projections, they obviously have really important societal consequences for things like water resources and sea level rise at large scales, but also glacier hazards at smaller scales. So there's a lot of exciting avenues for future work, and I'm excited to see how we continue to push things forward as a community. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, David. Has anyone got any questions to ask? Just for anyone that's new on the call, we usually ask people to just put something into the chat to say they've got a question, and then we get you to unmute and actually ask your question in person. Just makes it all much more friendly and intimate. So if anyone has a question, please put it on the chat. Leanne Schuster, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, thank you a lot, David, for a nice talk. So we are here from the OGGM edu, OGGM, not edu, OGGM workshop, and we just had one question. So maybe can you give us a bit more insights about how you how you implemented this emulator?
Yeah, so what we ended up doing, we did some tests to find that we could run about 30 different model simulations of the actual forward model. And then using PyTorch, we were able to fit an emulator that performed quite reasonably just for the mass balance, the modeled mass balance between 2000 and 2020. So the major benefit there is then we're using an emulator which goes super fast. And so instead of running a forward model 10,000 times, we're only running it 30 and then using the emulator for the rest.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Lynn, did you have anything else you wanted to follow up with, or? No. Okay, Paco, you have a question. Go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, nice talk, David. I enjoyed. I'm curious about the measurements of the debris thickness with GPR, and so I would like to know about your feeling of how good this is. And I'm curious about first, what GPR frequency you used. Second, what kind of radio wave velocity you found in the debris, and also whether there were large variations in this radio wave velocity, because I guess that you had the opportunity to measure directly the debris cover in some areas, and also to measure by GPR. So you were able probably to compute the radio wave velocity and to know whether there were large variations or not.
Yeah, great question. So the GPR studies that I was showing were not mine. So sorry if I gave that impression. I would love to do GPR work on debris-covered glaciers, but have not. So those were the primary people that have done that, have been Lindsay Nicholson and Mike McCarthy. And it seems, I mean, they validated the approach against in situ measurements. So it seems like it performs reasonably well. Yeah, like all measurements, there can be a potential sampling bias because you know, you're walking, typically it's easier to walk on areas that have slightly thicker debris. And so you could potentially have some biasing issues, but you have the same issues associated with manual excavation, which is what I've used in the past, where it's really challenging to measure debris thicknesses that are greater than 50 centimeters, let alone a meter.
And do you remember about the GPR frequency or not?
I do not remember the specific frequencies. No,
yeah.
I can follow up with you afterwards and pass along a couple of papers that have done that.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a question for David? I had a quick question about your rainbow-colored pie charts that you showed us, but it was more as just to check that I have the interpretation correct. The grey sections of those pie charts, does that represent the area that has melted at the end of the century? Have I? Yeah. So the ones that essentially are mostly grey, the glaciers are fully melted.
Exactly. Yeah.
And those presumably didn't include the major ice sheets in the pie charts.
No. Yeah. So sorry about that. I should have specified that at the beginning of my talk. We're just working on all of the mountain glaciers and ice caps. We don't. None of this is working with the ice sheets. So we look at a specific level of the RGI glaciers and leave the other ones to the ice sheet modelers.
Brilliant, thank you. I just wanted to check that I'd interpreted that correctly. Are there any further questions for David? Hester?
Hi, David. Fantastic talk. Sorry, I can't see myself here. Yeah, and fantastic figures. And I had a question about one figure, but kind of have a more broad question. One of those figures where you did the sub-regional kind of differences with the dots of the red ones, there was also a difference in size of the dots. Can you explain what that was?
Yeah, that was just to give some indication of the glacier area within those 1 degree or to 2 degree tiles.
Right. I think you need to check Jan Mayen because
Okay.
that was a very large dot.
Okay.
And it's a very tiny area. So my question is a little bit related to that. There's been a recent paper by Hans Ulemans and Keller who implemented, the really simple models. And then the whole question is about where is the uncertainty. So there's still like a lot of uncertainty about glacier thicknesses and sometimes DEMs. But in fact, in your climate projections, there's also large uncertainty. So taking everything together, what is your kind of idea of where the most uncertainties are? And you've pointed out that debris cover is one, but what are the others?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the debris cover uncertainty is pretty small compared to the other sources of uncertainty. You know, key sources of uncertainty, Ben Marzine's paper went into this in the second Glacier MIP exercise. The climate change scenario really dominates the sources of uncertainty by the end of the century. Earlier in the century, the model physics parameterizations come into play. It's a bit challenging to understand how much of that uncertainty comes into play due to the model physics versus the sources of calibration data, right? Because in Glacier MIP, every study is calibrating their model differently. So I think it's still a really active area of research. And also there aren't very good ways of aggregating uncertainties yet from individual glaciers to larger scales, as well as thinking about aggregating the uncertainties over time, so from monthly to annual to decadal scales. So I think it's definitely an area that could be significantly improved.
Okay, thanks.
Great, and I think we have another question from the OGGM workshop, and I guess it's not Lillian asking this question, so you might have to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks David for your talk. I'm Dylan, I'm Regina's new PhD student. We haven't met before, but I think we will talk again later. I'm just curious because we're here at this OGGM workshop. So a lot of people here working on this OGGM model. If you could just quickly comment on how PyGEM differentiates itself from OGGM and how you see the future of these two models together or separately.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I could be there too to answer this in person, hopefully next year. You know, OGGM Fabian and company have spent tons of time making their model incredibly easy to use, incredibly well documented. So PyGEM by comparison is difficult to use compared to OGGM. We're still lacking behind, primarily because dedicated resources towards pushing the science and publications a little bit at the expense of the code and usability. Some of the major differences, which various people are starting to work on as well, the mass balance parameterization. What we've done with PyGEM is essentially made it such that it works with the OGGM framework. Another thing is the frameworks that we use to run the model. OGGM, well, we both still operate on a glacier by glacier basis, but for a lot of the calibration data sets, I find that it's easier to do the Bayesian inference and the calibrations kind of outside of OGGM's glacier directories. So it's for the speed of development, it's been a bit easier to continue to use PyGEM's structure and utilize OGGM's various parameterizations for glacier dynamics and those sorts of things. But I mean, the future is, in my opinion, is really advancing things together. So now that we've made things complementary such that they can talk to one another, I don't see us ever moving away from that.
Okay, oops. Okay, thanks. There's actually a follow-up question from somebody else here at the workshop.
Thanks, Dylan. Who's the next person at your workshop? It's fantastic.
Great.
Hello, David. Thank you for your talk. I'm Hamid. I have a question regarding the debris cover. Do you have any plan to add the debris evaluation in the PyGEM or in OGGM later to see how is the debris dynamic in the future?
Sorry, I didn't hear part of that question. Did we validate the debris thickness or
yeah, in the future, how is changing? How is the expansion of the debris cover?
Yeah, so that's one of the assumptions that we made. So right now, our debris cover extents are stagnant. So we don't account for the expansion of debris cover over time. This is something that Loris Campagno and Matthias Huss have recently implemented for high mountain Asia in a study that's on the cryosphere discussions. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. With some quick back of the envelope calculations as to the potential end glacial concentrations. For thick debris, it's not really going to change too much. So the big impacts are going to be what happens at that interface between clean ice and debris cover. So that expansion may or may not be important.
Fantastic. Are there more questions from the workshop, or?
Well, I think for the moment not. So thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's fantastic to coincide actually with that. So I think we've run out of questions. So thank you very much indeed to David for a very sobering talk, but really fantastic detail and wonderful graphics actually. Thought they were really useful and unusual and different, and it made you think about the results. So thank you very much indeed for a fabulous and really clear talk. And thank you very much also for putting up the slide for next week's seminar there. So another image which is pretty striking, looking at mapping ice velocity to reconcile ice thickness distribution with glacier dynamics. So I hope to see you at next week's seminar, and a really big thank you to David for today's, this evening's, this morning's, whatever it is for you, seminar. So thank you very much indeed. So
thanks a lot.
Lots of thank yous coming on the chat there. See you all next week.